I realize that by recording this episode, I may be infinitesimally reducing my own success rate at getting grants in the future, but I think it's worth it to talk about these issues in the open. This episode is about writing competitive grant proposals. I have received 2 or more grants from the NSF, NIH, and Department of Defense in the United States, and have also reviewed for those particular agencies 2 or more times. I think that the fundamental core of writing a good grant proposal is applicable to any agency, and actually any international agency as well. How does your career stage affect the grants you apply to? There are 2 real phases in applying for grants. There's the early investigator stage, so the young investigator awards that you apply to in your first, say, 5 years when you start your faculty position. And then after that, there's kind of a valley of death where you don't get anything. At least I didn't get anything for 3 years after I kind of aged out of the early investigator stage, and then my proposals went into the main pool with everyone else that has been applying to grants for 30 to 40 years. What is the best way to get a grant funded? There's no silver bullet. So there are great ideas that get bad scores. You catch a reviewer on a bad day or a bad week. That actually does happen. Sometimes they might have a score to settle with your advisor. Hopefully the panel discussion will weed out some of those problems, but sometimes they persist. And bad projects do get funded. So sometimes you'll see at the bottom of a paper that you didn't think very much about, that all this paper had funding from whatever agency, and you're saying, well, how did that get funded and my project did not get funded? So it does, these things happen, and it's kind of subjective. So there's no silver bullet. You can't just say, like, if you do these things you definitely will get this grant, because nothing is ever 100% successful. But your goal should be maximizing the probability of a successful outcome. Also, don't take rejection personally, because it's going to happen like 80 to 90% of the time, especially when you're first starting out. The first thing you need to do is to generate a good idea. The idea for the grant, the fundamental core of the grant, is by far the most important thing. So a lot of times we worry about, moving pixels over in figures and making sure that we're exactly, have exactly the right margins and word count and no widows at the end of paragraphs, and all these things, are great to satisfy our kind of anal retentive instincts, but they can't really correct for an idea that doesn't arouse any scientific excitement on the part of the reviewers. With stale ideas, reviewers are more likely to find gotcha type criticisms, like not enough preliminary data, didn't cite all the right literature. Basically, they'll have these ex post facto rationalizations when really it's just the idea didn't excite them. So there needs to be an exciting idea at the core, where you've identified a significant problem, you have a creative solution to it, and it is believable that you, as an investigator at the institution that you are at, have the right resources to bring this project to a successful outcome. Conversely, if a reviewer likes a proposal, then a lot of these sort of anal retentive, hedge trimming that you did to get it, exactly perfect, they're going to ignore all of that. In fact, they might even misinterpret some of the experiments you propose in a way that actually benefits you. So I've had this happen, where it's some experiment that they describe in the summary statement is not something that I actually quite proposed, but they were kind of excited by the idea, so they gave me the benefit of the doubt for that. So the idea can really sort of whitewash a lot of these little things that we tend to take very seriously as we're writing, that aren't really that important. What's better, single investigator or multiple investigator grants? Single investigator grants are increasingly hard to get. And in NSF, it's still, pretty likely to get a single investigator grant. In the NIH, however, it's really difficult. Collaborative grants are really attractive because a lot of the new knowledge to be created is actually at the interface between established disciplines. If you're going to collaborate with somebody, it's important that the collaboration not feel forced. So a lot of times, particularly in medical applications, you might have somebody, like you might have an engineer come up with some solution that they don't have a problem for, and then they kind of search through their medical school to find somebody. The medical personnel kind of signs off and sends in the biosketch, and they're part of the team, but they didn't really contribute, and it just looks like a forced collaboration, not something that really epitomizes complementarity. And sometimes engineers in particular have a problem where they have hammers, but they're just looking for nails. How do you come up with a fundable idea? The best way to generate new ideas is to start early and write notes to yourself. And these could be in the form of a notepad app on your phone or email yourself. So if you email yourself to then later transfer those notes, it could be in the middle of the night, you have some great idea. Email it yourself. 99% of the time, you're going to look at the note, and a day later, you're going to decide that it was not a good idea, but it's always best to start somewhere. A great tool is to expose your ideas to criticism when the cost is low. So subject your ideas to conversational pressure of people that you're not afraid of embarrassing yourself in front of. So these could be colleagues you go to lunch with or to coffee with, or they could be colleagues from grad school or postdoc or undergrad, or your old advisors, and maybe email them, call them up, and just run your ideas by them. You don't even have to say that you're thinking about writing a grant about this. Just see what their reaction is, because these people are professionals too, and they might be able to anticipate some of the most common criticisms, or just something they say may dissuade you from pursuing that as an idea. When you're crafting your idea, it's really important that it find the right home. So this could be at the programmatic level, or it could even be at the agency level. And you want to make sure that the people to whom your proposal will be routed are the ones that will give it the most receptive reading. And the best way to do that is to figure out if the granting mechanism that you are applying to has funded ideas of the type that you are proposing. So the best way to do that is to go to the NSF website or equivalent and look at what has been funded through this project. And NIH, for example, has the projectreporter.nih.gov that will give you a rundown of the projects by PI, by start date, by funding, and lots of other identifying information. And you can even access the public abstracts using these services, which are very, very useful. Should you talk to the program manager ahead of time? I have a couple of anecdotes about this when it didn't work particularly well for me. I can never quite get the timing right as to when is the best time to approach a program manager. So early on, I think this was my start of my third year, I submitted a proposal, but it was about a week before the due date, and I was going to be in Washington, D.C., so I scheduled a meeting with this program manager. And we had a good conversation. I didn't ask anything specifically about the proposal that I submitted because it was too late to do anything. And I actually thought that by talking to him after I submitted the proposal, it would reduce the perception of a conflict because there was nothing that I could do. It was already submitted. So on the due date, I got a phone call from this particular program manager saying that I was trying to seek an unfair advantage from the by speaking to him, and I assured him that there was nothing I could do, and that I was really just interested in in understanding the scope of the program for future proposals. So maybe this was a beginner's error on my part, but then a few months later, for a different agency, I hadn't even thought about what I was going to propose, but I emailed a program manager saying I was going to be in Washington, D.C. and wondering if they wanted to meet with me. And they said that it would be unethical to meet with me in advance of the deadline, which wasn't for another like 2 months. Don't let the program manager discourage you. If they say that this is not quite in the scope, or to tell you to do something based on an email or a conversation at a conference or even in a white paper, they don't know what you're going to put in the proposal, and they don't know how it's going to review. Although they do have some experience, what are the odds that you could explain it in kind of a nervous short email as well as you could in a 15-page proposal? So another scenario is when I submitted a proposal, it got reviewed, but ultimately declined. And I rewrote the proposal the following year, submitted it to the same program, and it got desk rejected by the program manager. And the program manager assured me that they tried to find a new home for it, but were not able to find a new home for it. And, tough luck, it was up to me. So because I had this proposal, I worked really hard on it. I found another program myself. I don't know if they talked to this program manager or not. I sent it in there, and it received a favorable score and was ultimately funded. And this is in the same agency. So don't let them discourage you. They don't know, based on the email you send, everything that's in the proposal. So take it for what it's worth. How many times do you have to submit a proposal before it gets funded? It is really important to iterate. It's pretty rare to get a proposal funded on the first try. My postdoc advisor told me no proposal ever goes to waste, and she meant this in a few different ways. One is that you can always resubmit, take the reviewer's comments to heart, and resubmit. You can also dice up the proposal. So sometimes the criticisms are, this is too much stuff to propose in one grant, and it is possible to take the aims or the tasks and to develop them into their own proposals. And I had a case a couple of years ago where a big proposal that I wrote was deemed too much here, not enough preliminary data, the usual stuff. And I took the aims and resubmitted them elsewhere, and one of them actually did get funded to a mechanism that was a little bit more modest, I would say. But the proposal did not go to waste. We got something out of it. It's also possible, because you did a lot of research to write the proposal, that it could become the basis of a review article or mini review article. I've had cases in both senses where I had written something that was rejected, turned it into a review, and then totally rewrote the proposal so there was no plagiarism. And then another case, a proposal I wrote was so badly ripped apart that the language from that basically became a mini review article. How do you go about writing the text of the grant? The goal of the writing is not to make yourself look smart or to give every good idea you've ever had, every bit of preliminary data you've ever had. The goal is to delight the audience. And it's almost true that if you delight the thinking audience with your acumen, your good idea, the puzzle that you are proposing, the clarity of your prose, it is much more likely that they are going to go into the panel meeting as your advocate. So who are your readers? Your readers are going to be maybe 2 to 5 panelists plus the program manager or a scientific review officer. Every sentence needs to delight the reader. The proposal is a psychology experiment designed to bring the reader over to your way of thinking so that they can talk about you in as positive a light as possible to the other panelists and to the program manager. What you should do is teach the reader your topic, set up a puzzle, and show how your proposal solves the puzzle. One of the surest ways to delight the reader is to make them feel smart. You want them to be a fan of your work and go to bat for your idea with the panel. So be as clear as possible. Use short words. If it's a normal English word, try to keep it to 4 syllables or less. Of course, there are other words that we recognize as being simple words, even though there are a lot of syllables, like the word automatically, which is 5 syllables. But in general, don't reach for the thesaurus. Don't try to sound smart. Write in as transparent of prose as possible. Also use short sentences. So 20 words is a good length for a sentence. Definitely not 40 words, and try to keep your 30-word sentences to a minimum. Then there's a question of to jargon or not to jargon, and this is actually the subject of debate among really serious people. So there's an idea that if some of your reviewers don't understand what you're talking about, then they may assume that you have more competence in the topic than you actually do. So there's a tendency to use big words and jargon to increase the perceived scholarly impact. And where does this idea come from? Well, there's a lot of bad scholarly writing that's written in academese, what Steven Pinker in his book would call academese. And this strategically over time is a bad way to approach a grant proposal. In fact, I actually had a short email exchange with Steven Pinker himself about this, and I'll read a little bit of my email to him. I have a suspicion that some degree of incomprehensibility in a document such as a grant proposal is occasionally rewarded by reviewers. I suspect that experiments described too lucidly are regarded as too simple or obvious and thus not worthy of funding, while a different proposal describing similar experiments but described esoterically are given credibility by the jargon. Academese could also have the effect of masking poor experimental design. In a proposal written with a transparent style, however, the defects in the methodology are detected easily. I do not have data to support this hypothesis, and it would be difficult to test. And in other contexts, I have, for example, noticed that that department seminar is delivered so that 99% of the audience understands 99% of the content are sometimes regarded as unimpressive because sometimes clarity suggests obviousness. And I got a reply from Steven Pinker, and I won't read the reply verbatim because I didn't ask for permission, but basically he said that this fear is overblown and that clarity in prose is basically always regarded by reviewers as a sign of intelligence and care, and you have deburdened them from extracting ideas from opaque prose. And he admits the fact that it's possible in some circumstances that obscure prose can be used to bluff, but strategically this is actually a bad idea to use this intentionally. So for better or worse, everything that I try to write, I'm quite sure I explained in the simplest way I know how. How does funding at NSF work? So the key word for NSF is transformative. What the reviewer wants to see, what the program manager is trying to do, is to create a new field. They really support wild and crazy ideas. They are oriented toward discovery-driven science in general, and this is to contrast the NSF with some of the other agencies that I'll discuss in a moment. So proof of concept helps, but extensive preliminary data are generally not necessary in the same way that they are in an NIH R01 proposal. So each proposal gets at least 3 reviewers, including the lead reviewer, and the lead reviewer reads the proposal a few weeks ahead of time, hopefully not on the plane on the way there, ideally at least a couple days ahead of time. And the lead reviewer introduces the proposal to the panel. And the panel consists of maybe 12 to 15 members. And while they have access to the proposal, the other panelists probably won't have read it. There is a scribe reviewer. The scribe reviewer's job is to summarize the panel discussion. There are 1 or more additional reviewers as well that contribute to the discussion. Now, anyone in the room can contribute to the discussion or ask questions. The program manager in NSF has a lot of discretion over the type of panels that are used and whether panels are used. So some program managers don't use panels and do everything remotely. That is by email. Of course, right now during COVID, everything is remote. So then proposals, when the program manager gets the critiques back from the panelists, they are ranked from highest to lowest based on the submitted critiques. So those are excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor, with some hybridization possible. So then the panelists have the explicit job of making funding recommendations in their critiques, and then the program manager makes the final decision, taking into account the scientific review, but also programmatic, strategic, and budgetary considerations. How does the NIH system differ? So NIH, in contrast, separates the scientific evaluation from the funding consideration. So there are really two groups involved in the evaluation of a procedure of a proposal. One is the Center for Scientific Review. The other is the ICs, or the institutes and centers. The Center for Scientific Review does just that. They review the proposals, they generate the critiques, and so forth. In reviewing an NIH proposal, the reviewers will be asked to score the proposal based on the 5 review criteria, and those are significance, approach, innovation, investigator, and environment. So each reviewer is instructed to score each proposal based on those criteria from a 1 to 9 scale, and it's like golf. So the lower the score, the better. There is a 6th score, and the 6th score is by far the most important, and that is the overall impact score. Strictly speaking, the reviewers are directed not to make the impact score simply the mean of the 5 criterion scores, and the reason is because the significance may outweigh the environment. So the impact score is probably going to be within the range established by the 5 criterion scores, but it will not be an average of the 5 criterion scores. So you want to make sure when writing a proposal that you establish the 5 review criteria as explicitly as possible. The significance is this. The approach is this. Investigators are strong because of this. The environment is strong because there's evidence of support for the investigators in the past. The innovation is strong based on prior literature. So if you can point the reviewer toward these particular statements, that you can define your own range if your arguments are good. And of course, your arguments have to be good. One thing I want to say about an NIH grant versus an NSF grant is the NIH mechanism is it has to, this goes without saying, but it has to have health relevance, right? So it can't be a purely discovery oriented project in the same way that that NSF is. That said, there are two principal types of funding mechanisms, and one is more exploratory than the other. So the R21 is a 2-year grant for exploratory research, and that is a 6-page research strategy plus a specific aims page. The specific aims page is kind of like the technical abstract that is very important to set the tone for the rest of the proposal. So that's the R21. The R01 also has a specific aims page. It's 12 pages for the research strategy, and it is a 5-year grant for developing an idea that's already been established or proven using preliminary data or rigor. There are a smattering of other types of mechanisms within NIH, but perhaps the most common ones, particularly for young investigators, are the Director's High Risk, High Reward awards, like the Early Independence Award, which is for postdocs or senior graduate students who want to skip the postdoc. There's the NIH Director's New Innovator Award. Then there's the Transformative Research Award, which is basically like an R01, except that the high risk, high reward nature is rewarded in the sense that you don't need extensive preliminary data, although the budget and timeline and formatting is similar to a regular R01. And then there's the Pioneer Award, which is usually awarded to established investigators to explore an idea of exceptionally lasting impact or perceived exceptionally lasting impact. So when you're submitting your proposal, first you get you find the FOA, Funding Opportunity Announcement, and then you want to tailor it toward a particular institute and study section, because you get to suggest the study section and the institute. They don't have to follow your suggestion, but this is an important part of seeing that your proposal gets the right people to read it. So in terms of study sections, there are over 100 study sections that serve all of the institutes. So, for example, cellular and molecular technologies might serve programs within National Institute of General Medical Sciences or National Cancer Institute. But if it involves cellular and molecular technologies, then it goes there, and then it's later routed back to the funding institute. The study section rosters are published, and the study sections themselves consist of some number of standing members, which have some fixed term, and then some number of individuals who rotate in and out. Each reviewer is given maybe 8 to 12 proposals to read. The critiques are sent to the scientific review officer, and then the panel meets. And the panel consists of the entire study section. Maybe it's 30-ish members. And basically this works like a trial, where the 3 reviewers behave as the lawyers. And if they liked it, they are they're a defense attorney. If they didn't like it, they are a prosecutor. And then the rest of the study section is like the jury. There are 2 people sort of at the top of the food chain here. One is the chair of the study section, who is actually a voting member of the study section, and they kind of get the review moving along. They cut off discussion if it becomes like a conference, which sometimes it does. And then importantly, they write the summary statement. So they write the statement that summarizes the discussion. The other person at the top of the food chain is the scientific review officer, who at this point has been the reviewer's primary point of contact and who assembled the study section. And they do not make scientific arguments during the review process, but rather they discuss, or they can guide the discussion based on what is or is not admissible during the discussion, and are the expert in procedural aspects of the review process. I didn't mention that only the top 50% of scored reviews get discussed, and then the worst 2 words in the English language for a biomedical researcher are not discussed, and that's what happens to the proposals that don't make it to the discussion. So, at the beginning of the discussion, each reviewer gives a score from 1 to 9 that is their impact score. So you get 3 scores that define this initial range. Then after the whole discussion and after the panel summary is read, the reviewers give their updated scores, which could change as a result of the discussion. So then those 3 scores now define the range. And then everybody on the panel, remember these are this is the jury, gets to vote with a score. And this is a silent vote, but those individuals that vote outside the range must identify themselves. And if they vote outside the range for a reason that has not already been articulated during the discussion, they have an opportunity to say why they're voting outside the range. So in terms of writing a successful proposal, it's really important that you define your own criterion scores to the extent possible. And to me, that is identifying the significance, approach, innovation, investigator, and environment, and strengths therein as explicitly as possible and as early as possible. So to me, that means putting these criteria in the specific games page and then hammering them home over and over, because that will define the range of the impact score chosen by your 3 reviewers. And then the 3 reviewers' impact scores define the range of scores given by the rest of the panel. So that score, 1 to 9, are then averaged and multiplied by 10, and that becomes the impact score. The other score that you might get is the percentile, and that is the percentile within the study section. Neither metric in itself will actually tell you whether or not the proposal is going to get funded. Maybe scores under 40 are good, under 30 are better, but really the funding decision is not made until those reviews get routed to the program officer, program director within the institute and center. Then they undergo a council review, which decides based on the evidence of the scientific merit and also programmatic and strategic and budgetary considerations what proposals will be funded. Of course, the lower your score, the higher the chances for funding, but there are other considerations. How does funding at the Department of Defense differ? The last department that I want to talk about is the Department of Defense. So in the US, this includes the Army, Navy, and Air Force research offices. More so than NSF or NIH, the program officer has a lot of discretion as to what projects are funded within their program's portfolio. So while they still use a peer review system, those reviews are at the discretion of the program manager whether or not they are released. And in this case, it's really important to reach out to a program manager well ahead of time. Some ways to do this are to attend program review meetings, which are usually free and usually open to the public, depending on space. The problem is they're not publicized, so you have to know who's in the program. Then, of course, you want to contact the program manager for permission to attend, and if there's space, they will probably say yes. So that is by far the best way to see the breadth of research happening in a particular program within a DoD funding agency. The issue of, I think some people mistakenly think that a DoD grant is not basic science, it has to be engineering. That's really not true. Ideally, a DoD grant is written with the same attention to the basic science issues as an NSF grant, with some interest to the particular office that you are applying to, more or less explicitly stated. But it's not as if you have to, design a new soldier suit or whatever and have a deliverable. That's more like DARPA. I don't have any experience with DARPA, so I'm not going to talk about that agency in particular. So that's it. I hope I said at least one useful thing here. Good luck in your proposals, and I will see you next time.